You're tuned in to 92.1 WOMR FM Provincetown and 91.3 WFMR FM Orleans, the voice and spirit of Cape Cod. I bid you welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, chartered herbalist and psychic medium. Healing Wisdom explores mind, body, soul connections as we discuss the healing effects of the arts, metaphysical concepts, intuition, and the spiritual aspects of everyday living. Healing Wisdom begins in the heart. Our theme music is provided by Mystic Pete. Hello, 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 Cape Cod and beyond. My guest today is Carina Stroh. She is a local herbalist with over 20 years of experience learning from plants. She worked for 6 years at 2 different herb farms, and Carina studied at David Winston's Center for Herbal Studies. Welcome, Carina.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
When did you first fall in love with plants?
That I recognized would be when I went to massage school. I was in Denver, Colorado, and in the massage school was also an acupuncture school. And they had this shop that had strange looking things in it, and just started learning and finding out more. But I guess that was probably the first time that I recognized it as something that was calling me. And when I look back, I remember eating sucking the nectar out of red clover in my yard before I even knew that was a thing.
Very cool. Yeah. It's interesting because when I look back at my path as an herbalist, like I there's certain highlights. Like I used to make garlands out of red clover, for example, and I used to make garlands out of Life Everlasting, and now I'm using them with my clients and to help relax them, and they're anti-aging, rejuvenative, heliochrysum, and I'll be soaking their feet, and I'm like, oh yeah, like I can see where that started. And I had the same experience of a calling feeling. Like I remember being in my first herbal shop and I started smelling all these different things and looking at all these different plants in a new way.
Totally.
Yeah. So I'm curious what, once you got hooked on the excitement of this new experience in terms of like the smells and the feel of the teas and different things you started making, you make a lot of different projects and you teach people how to work with medicine in a number of different ways. And I'm interested in your first like connection to healing yourself or others.
Well, it's been a long journey, so I'm not sure if I can identify my first. But
or just going back to that time.
Yeah, like earlier on when I moved to the Cape in 2005 was when I really got into herbalism. Like prior to that, I was just kind of learning from books and some, weekend workshops or whatever. But when I moved to the Cape, I got connected to some other herbalists, and I really got into it, and I started making products. And I remember my first comfrey salve that I made. I so wanted to do it just perfect, and I was a measurer, and so I was doing this, and then but there wasn't any instructions like leave it on this degree of heat for this long. It was way too ambiguous for me. So of course I keep heating it, and it goes like it's burnt before I know it. And I'm like, I'd spent all this time, days, and I'd, collected it. And it was like my little, like, not baby, that sounds weird, but it was my project. It mattered. But I was instructed to, you can't use that. So it was this process that's where the process of learning from the plants really began. Like I started listening to them as I was making different things, and then specifically making teas with people. That felt easy to me for some reason, as I learned what different plants what different properties plants had. I learned how you could mix them together and energetically if they produced warming or cooling effects for people, and then to match those with the people I was talking to, like what are their needs and what were their, like, were they people who were usually always cold or always hot, and how those two mixed together was really where I fell in love with the art of herbal medicine making.
Yeah, very cool. So can you go into that more about herbal energetics? Because I think that oftentimes, there's a number of factors that can inhibit herbal medicine from working with people. Number one thing I think is that they don't give it long enough to work, and they'll try a cup of tea and that's it, or a tincture a couple of times. But it's the herbalist's job to really match the herbs with the client, and it takes patience to experiment to find the right formulas and to find the right herbs. Sometimes it's instant, but digestion and nutrition is a big component too, because the better our digestion works, the more easily we metabolize nutrients and so on and so forth. But another big component is the energetics and a person's constitution, and whether they're hot or cold or damp or dry. Whether they need something that's more yin or yang, it makes a huge difference in their receptivity, because they might have an issue where they have liver heat, but if they have a generally cold constitution, you put something hot, it's going to create way too much fire. So can you talk a little bit about the herbal energetics? And it can get complicated when you're dealing with people who say are generally cold, but they're going through menopause. So they have all this new heat in their body.
Right.
So
we are so complex. And for me, that's the beauty of herbal medicine. Now, I like what you mentioned as far as the nutrition components and how digestion, comes in. I usually start people out with the idea of, if you go into a health food store and you say, hey, I have a cold, what do you suggest? The person behind the counter is going to say, oh, here, try this. Other people have found it helpful. And it might work great, but it might work not great, because you didn't tell them any more than you have a cold. And colds can be very different. You can have, a really runny nose that's all clear. You could have a stuffed up congestion, and maybe you get something out that's yellow and sticky and gross. You can have a sore throat. There's so many. And those are all what we're talking about as far as energetics. What you're looking at is the energetics of the acute condition. And you're definitely looking at the energetics of the person when they're just their natural energetics. And what I was taught is any formula you make, I very rarely use just one herb at a time. So any formula you make, you're looking at the different energetics of that specific herb and how they affect people. And that overall blend is actually, you want it to be neutral. So when you were saying, you give someone something like ginger, which is really hot, to someone who already has heat energetics, it could easily make things worse or change things, but it could definitely be an overcompensation. So, I often combine herbs that are of opposite energetics to reach that neutral blend.
That would really be important and helpful in terms of a complex situation like hot flashes for someone who, say, has cold hands and feet,
Right, because you're not, you're not looking at just one part of the person. Like, I often tell people, like, I'm a matchmaker. I match up individuals with herbs. And I work a lot more at this point in my practice with nutritive formulas. Like, I love to blend teas for people that they can drink on a regular basis that helps what they're dealing with. It just supports and nourishes them. That is something I found really helpful, and I've been using that with my family and practicing for many years.
Yeah, I was thinking to give an example of like the way that I approach it. I just think it's kind of interesting to hear different people's perspectives. So I do work with the cold and the heat and the damp and the dry and all that, and thinking of yin and yang as being important. So I had a client come to me a couple days ago. She had shoulder pain. It's an accident that happened a while ago. And I was feeling like, her doctor was saying, well, gee, you should have kind of healed that by now. Like, oh, I don't know.
Right.
And so I'm thinking, okay, let's, maybe something that's powerfully pain relieving, anodyne, something topically like wintergreen. But I was also thinking there's an emotional component to what's going on. And I was feeling that, number one, she should be taking something internally for the pain. But after talking about it, it sounded like there was both shooting pain and soreness in the muscles.
Right.
And I was feeling like the trauma was in her fascia. So I'm thinking, okay, ideally she's taking something that's antispasmodic, that's nervine, and then something. I was kind of trying to get to the bottom of where the trauma was. And after talking about the incident, I was feeling like it was her heart that really was the part. And then the left side is yin, is the female side. Right. It's the receptive side. It's the emotional side. It's the intuitive side. So in going to make her formula, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking like maybe some flowers for her heart, something that's uplifting, that's yin, that's feminine. And then something that's maybe moves her energy, because I was feeling like she had blocked energy. So anyway.
Yeah, well, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that is another like benefit of being able to practice herbal medicine, because we don't have to stop and just be like shoulder and only look at the shoulder and only look at the pain. For me, when I talk to people about pain, because, there's so much of that out there, I go to first, there's a stuckness, whether it's, physically, there's not the mobility in the shoulder, like just to take that example of the shoulder, there hasn't been the mobility to really increase the circulation. So I also think of that as a secondary really important factor of any pain is it getting proper circulation. And like you were going to address topically and internally, I agree totally. Pretty much whenever I'm, if there's anything that I can do both topically and internally for someone, I want to suggest that, because I feel like why not, especially with pain.
Yeah, and what's interesting to note too is a lot of times somebody will say, well, I used to take one thing.
Right.
And that one thing they stopped taking, and then things changed.
Right.
So,
yeah, so
whether it's arnica or aloe or something, yeah.
Well, and also the other thing that I love is that herbal medicine lends itself to really empowering that individual to know their own body. Because I believe that people know what they need. They might not know the specific herbs that I would suggest, because that's not their training, but they can certainly tell you how that pain feels. And that is the most important thing that we as herbalists can ask when people say they're in pain. Like, what does it feel like? And so it's to say that it's sharp and stabbing. For me, I think of sweet melilot. Like, that's my training of like, that is a specific pain herb for shooting pain. So it's not where I stop, but I like, I'm going to put that on the list and see where it comes out as I kind of process through it. But to really empower people to know, oh, I used to try this, and to ask them, has anything ever helped with pain before? What's your experience? When I'm talking to people about like the whole concept of being in a relationship with plants, I move into that bit and I ask them what their story with plants are. And usually first they say, I don't know what you're talking about. And then I say, well, do you remember growing up and maybe somebody you knew grew herbs, maybe your mom or grandmother cooked with them? Or usually I'll say a few things and they'll say, oh, there was this thing that happened. And once you kind of get them into their own story of a relationship with plants, I think that they're much more at ease with herbal medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we have to remind people that they have a connection with, because it's something that our ancestors have done. Every single home used to have, at some point, to have, all over the world, people grew herbs for medicine, or they would forage for them very close to their home. So it was a part of their everyday life, because we needed to take care of flus and fevers and headaches before pharmaceutical medicine came along, before drug companies came along. We needed to heal cuts and bruises and bee stings, and we needed to heal broken bones, and we needed to heal bleeding, hemorrhaging. Mm-hmm. So this was common knowledge for many people.
Right. So, and we've forgotten it. We've forgotten it. But many of us do have mothers, grandmothers, great grandfathers, somebody at some point who knew something about how to heal. Yeah. When people can connect to that, it's a really good gateway. So can you talk about growing your own medicine? Because you do. It's a very empowering thing. Yeah. So, I mean, my journey of growing plants, growing herbal medicine, like I worked at a couple medicinal herb farms, which really empowered me because I got to know a lot of the details and the processing of plants. So, right now I have these gardens and I have different medicinal plants from motherwort to southernwood to echinacea to fennel. I even put things in like walking onions. That's not a traditional medicinal plant, but of course it is. It's our food. So at this point in my journey, I'm not so concerned with what I call things. I usually am like, oh, hi, like it's a plant and it has medicinal properties, whether they're defined in books and defined in practices of like mullein we use for respiratory, ailments. But this year I watched a beautiful mullein plant grow and I kept thinking, oh, those are beautiful leaves. I should harvest it and put it up and dry it and make it into a product. But there was something about just watching it grow. There was something about just watching it become this big, mighty plant. Like I was aware, for mullein, you're aware of this, but mullein, you use the leaves, you use the flowers, you can even use the roots. But I just felt compelled to just sit with this plant.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm talking about, like the medicinal value of plants outside our understanding of using them in teas or tinctures or lotions. Those are all great. It really depends on where the person is on their journey. But I just feel like that's not measurable. Like it's not measurable for me to say I sat with this mullein plant throughout the summer. People think, whoa, okay. But for me, where I was and what I needed, it was exactly what I needed.
Well, that really describes probably the joy that a lot of gardeners feel. They can't explain why they love gardening or why they need to spend time caring for the garden when other people are like, not understanding this like direct connection. It's interesting because this week I had 3 visual art clients and they were in my office and I just felt like there's something about people responding to beauty and the art that they're creating that takes people on a journey with them.
Yeah.
And so when they express themselves visually, there's something more than meets the eye about the aesthetic sense.
Right.
So our appreciation of beauty, especially in nature and especially art that reflects something about nature, it moves us beyond explanation. And when you're talking, I was thinking it was really common for people to have a favorite tree as a kid growing up.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of people had a favorite place, like on parents' or grandparents' property or their, and a lot of times that's about this. It's about the aesthetics. It's about that sense from. I mean, I think of it as plant spirit medicine.
Right. I think you're right. It's a good way to look at it.
But it's just, for a lot of people, tuning into a plant is just as alive as a cat or a dog.
Yes.
It has just as much personality. And certainly when you watch a bee pollinate your favorite plant or a butterfly land on it or little beetles or whatever it is, you see it, and we're seeing it respond to the sun and the wind and the rain.
It's interesting.
It's a very meditative practice.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, it made me think about when I first got into growing plants. I really loved when they were in full bloom, looked lush. There were no brown leaves. Like they were in their like peak, right? It's like that's
Sure.
and that's why that was the purpose of growing them. Mm-hmm. So in my mind at that time, and so as I progressed along my journey as a plant grower, now I love every little part of the year with these plants, whether it is in full summer, whether it's in the spring when they're just poking out of the ground, and there's something about those little fresh buds that haven't opened up. Like you just can feel the potential. And then if you're sitting with them, then you can kind of feel your own potential in that moment, to the fall where everything's kind of pulling in and like we can kind of feel it. Like I've been really enjoying this amazing weather we've been having, and I know that it's not going to last. So I'm just like soaking up all the ounce, and I feel like the plants do that. And like they've taught me to do that, like be present. And then I have this wonderful image. I have fennel that just has taken over. I mean, not taken over in a bad way, but just has really spread her wings in my gardens. And so I am fascinated by fennel in the middle of winter when we've had the storms and the winds and the snows, and it just, this stalk with this, like what's left of the flower embryo is just sitting there with like maybe some snow on the top of it. And just how that represents like standing in that wind, that winter wind, and how that feels and how that translates to our lives. So I find that inspirational, and I'm so happy that I can find that beauty. For me, it's beautiful even when a plant is like pulling in and turning brown. Now I can see that all those different stages are beauty.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you're talking about this, because I was thinking about how people really glorify youth. And of course, there's a whole cosmetic industry that is just pushes youth. And thinking that we really can embrace the beauty in nature aging. Mm-hmm. So to really be able to have the self-love about where we are, and to look like at ourselves as like we would look at like the roots of a tree, like totally. Okay, like so it's getting a little older, it might be the tree might be kind of moving to one side, it might be pulling up its roots on this side,
mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. Well, for me it is. It's that acceptance. This is what it is. This is where we are, and to really, it is beyond acceptance. Really, it's just a total appreciation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Totally. It's funny because there's weeds that I keep, like, well, knotweed is an invasive species, but it's also great for fighting the spirochetes of Lyme disease. But it often is the only flowering thing in an area, in different areas on Cape Cod.
Right.
So it helps the bees. And of course, the bee populations are, endangered. So it's really an important thing. And then medicinally, it's important. But in terms of invading and affecting other plants, it can be difficult, especially if you're gardening. But I think it's like, it's here, and it's like, deal with me, and it can provide shade, and it can provide so much aesthetic beauty. And the other thing that I was thinking was, the energy going into the roots at this time is kind of, and how you said you feel like you're learning from it, and you feel like you're kind of going within and regenerating. This is totally a time of regeneration. Yeah. And it's the best time to pick roots in the autumn. And it's time to sort of go like with these plants that have lost their flowers or they've went to seed, and to really look and harvest these things. There's something so amazing, even if you just pick one plant like dandelion or valerian root, or
I have tons of yellow dock right now.
Yellow dock,
yes. So I plan to harvest some and make a vinegar out of it. Not just that, but with garlic and what other things that I might put in there. That's
very cool. Yeah. So yellow dock, it grows everywhere on Cape Cod, and it's a blood cleanser. Mm-hmm. So you put it in vinegar. Yeah, because it's the blood cleanser is kind of like it helps increase the natural excretions of your body. As far as like, I think of it as a cleansing, but I also think of it as a building. Mm-hmm. So I think, that I think it's said to build blood. Mm-hmm. That's a really old terminology. And so I'm also very interested in the science. So I'm blending science and art
But it adds nutrition.
Yes.
That's why I'm picking it up right now and putting it in. And as you know, with many herbs, there are a lot of different reasons people use them and find them effective for a lot of different reasons. So, but yeah, with yellow dock, I would put it in because it's mineral dense. So it's like a nutritional or nourishing, and make that into a salad dressing. This is kind of
very cool. I'm going to try that. Yeah. So if folks are listening and they're thinking about maybe that there's a divine intelligence of the universe, and perhaps the weeds that are growing around them are growing around them for a reason, it's good to figure out what it is. There's even apps for herbs now. Yeah. I think iPlant is one of them.
I'm not as familiar with those, but yes, I go from like a little old school as far as make sure that you've identified it with somebody who knows what it is, like multiple times. I just saw on Facebook a really well-known, respected herbalist ended up in the ER because she had mistaken hemlock for Queen Anne's lace.
That's really too bad.
And so it's awful, but it's just a reminder. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, not too long ago, I was talking to a friend and we were walking around her yard and I was like, oh, that's so. She's like, that's so-and-so. And I'm like, oh, actually, I think it's somebody else. And until I got home and I thought about it a little bit more, something didn't feel right. But I got home and I was like, you know what? I was totally wrong. And so, I just have to even, just really make sure you know what you're
absolutely
doing.
Well, there are a lot of, hemlock and Queen Anne's lace is like the first one that you learn about, as two herbs that are easily confused. Yeah. And so there are, with mushrooms, you got to be really, really careful.
Dandelion even. How many times have you been out and there's these they're not dandelion, but they look like dandelion. And that's what I do on a lot of my herb walks. I will start with that. I'll be like, what is this? And they'll be like, dandelion. I'm like, actually, no, it's not. Now, in that case, it's another herb that has probably historically been used similarly than dandelion, and I can't remember the name of the one that I'm thinking of, but it's a yellow flower, but instead of having one flower per stem, it has multiple flowers per stem. So if you're not paying attention,
yes,
and dandelion also, even though that's such a common herb and we all know what dandelion is, sometimes the leaves look a little different. So
yes. So go on a plant identification walk, know your herbs, look at little YouTube videos, and then when you're really comfortable, but the plants that grow around us are oftentimes the ones that we need the most. So tell us your events coming up.
So I got a couple things coming up. I was asked to speak. I'm doing a talk on Listen to the Plants at Nauset Fellowship in Eastham, Friday, October 18th at 5:45 is when you want to show up. And then I'm doing a medicine making workshop. It's a 3-hour workshop. It's going to be at the Barnstable Land Trust, and I'm doing that through Resilient Roots, which is a great organization if you haven't checked them out. ResilientRootsCapeCod.org, I believe. And that workshop is November 2nd, 9:30 to 12:30 p.m.
Yes, and my final note is that at the change of seasons, it's very important to take vitamin C and to boost your immune system and to clean your body out, because the best medicine is preventative medicine. And if we take care of ourselves in the autumn, we have a much easier winter. Definitely. And so if people are feeling the allergies, do something about it now. Don't just brush it under the rug, because you'll be dealing with it later.
Yes.
If you're not doing something to take care of your body and keep it in shape now.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Karina Stroh, for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Pandora. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, certified chartered herbalist and psychic medium. You can find Healing Wisdom podcasts at WOMR.org. Contact me with any feedback, questions, or show ideas at peachypandora@yahoo.com. A big thanks to the Wizard of Operations, Matthew Dunn. Join me again next week.